Professor Enam Khan from the Bangladesh University, Jahangirnagar University. He's a professor of international relations. Professor Khan, may I now invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair, Professor Rohan Gunaratnam. I'm honored, certainly, and this is my privilege to be here, and I must congratulate the Defense University for hosting such an important event, 14th International Conference. This certainly shows Sri Lanka's prominence in international theater and unfolding strategic grid game that is happening around us. And I must congratulate the Sri Lankan government for facilitating such a wonderful and timely initiative, which I believe will contribute to the understanding, discourse, and narrative of security strategic studies and the foreign policy that we aspire to see for the greater benefit of South Asia and beyond. The chair, thank you very much for giving me the floor, and I must congratulate my previous speakers for bringing in very important points. Particularly, I will refer to two of my previous colleagues, Professor Kangas, who actually brought in the issues of values, which I think South Asian countries really look into quite seriously. Domestic politics, which has returned to the American foreign policy, internal dynamics, trade ties, which are dominating at the moment the American or perhaps the Western engagement with the rest of the world, and the essential implication of that we have seen in the Afghan theater. And perhaps the transnational challenges that Professor Kangas highlighted is certainly real when my colleague Nitin Gokhale brought in terms of radicalization, transnational issues, including pandemics and public health. And obviously, Professor Kangas brought in a very important factor, which is the withdrawal of the US forces, which was done purposefully. So it was not a surprise that the Americans will leave. Only problem was whether the South Asian countries were really ready to accept that reality that the Americans will leave today or tomorrow. So that's something we need to discuss today as well. And when Mr. Gokhale talked about the post-withdrawal narratives and what kind of national interest will come in, and he has really brought in, and this is something I wanted to talk about, is reprioritizing the national objectives. And that's exactly where Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the countries alike comes in by saying that now it is high time that we talk about our national power, and which has largely been missing in our strategic discussion, or even our bilateral discussions for a long time, which also focuses on the national interest. And the very genesis of national interest has been overlooked in many cases, whether our engagement with the West or the East, or perhaps our dealing with the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere. And I think the Sri Lankan government, or perhaps the government that I work with, the Bangladesh, is now at the cross point where the whole discussion of national interest prioritizes, or perhaps comes in their relationship with the other countries. So I think that narrative is returning to the state narratives, or perhaps the political leadership. The role of armed forces is something that, of course, has to be brought in. And even when we are talking today, I often teach at the National Defense College in Bangladesh, and as its academic advisor and the editor-in-chief for its journals. And in many cases, I have had the privilege of teaching allied course members, and in which Sri Lankan students are there. And many cases, now I feel that military diplomacy is something that we have overlooked for a long time. And particularly after the pandemic, the role of military diplomacy is something has returned to our discourse like anything, because the role of the armed forces has been in transition and transformation for last decades with the rise of artificial intelligence, new technologies, and perhaps the military technologies of the defense expenditure has been going through different kind of phases. And with the rise of new technologies, of course, the formation and the strategic priorities of the defense forces have altered to a great extent. With that, the modalities of the engagement of the armed forces have changed as well. And even if you look at the South China Sea and all the way to the strategic choke points or the SLOCs, the strategic line of communications, are telling you that there is the gap between, or the space between geoeconomics and geopolitics, or perhaps geostrategy, is blurring. And hence, the conventional diplomacy and the military diplomacy is also blurring. And in that case, even if you take the example of disaster management, many of my colleagues, and even in the first session, the role of the military cannot be seen in isolation, even in the pandemic recovery or the disaster management. You cannot really isolate the role of armed forces, even strategic airlifting, or even humanitarian assistance. So therefore, the role of military diplomacy is something that also needs to be revisited, military communication. And at least for Bangladesh, when the Rohingya crisis is a major factor, the military communication has become an important factor in dealing with my immediate neighbor. So for which I also see this is a new normal, that's something we have to reprioritize in future. Now that also tells us, one of my colleagues also brought in the issue of the new Taliban government. And obviously this is an interim government, and it's too early to make a comment on that. But certainly the first interim government actually fractured a bit in the confidence of the international community, given the composition that we have seen. But that also tells you the new politics that is going to stay. So the pragmatism. So new international politics in the central and the Chinese orbit is going to stay for a long time to come. So pandemic is a new normal, but on the other hand, the Afghan theater is going to present us a new political reality that is also normal. So with that, certain pragmatism has to come back. Now, what does it also mean? I mean, the countries like Bangladesh, I mean, if I tell you with a little bit of data, perhaps, which is needed to be understood, the economy of Bangladesh has been growing quite stable. I mean, at least the country is stable, doesn't have any maritime conflict with any of the countries, neighboring countries, and certainly doesn't have any instability factors working within the country, and presenting the world with some sort of stable economy. Hence, for countries like Bangladesh, which has done reasonably well in the pandemic situation, has two concerns. The first concern is the global supply chain, whether it will be stable or not. Now, meaning, if you take Bangladesh as a case example, has to supply its goods to the Western market, which means it has to balance the relationship between the supply chain and the supply chain that will go to its export destination. So import has to come from Beijing, and export has to go to Washington and alliances. So it has to make a balance between these two power centers, as my friend Professor Kangas has mentioned, and essentially whether you label it as a great power game, or perhaps the great power tussle, the reality for us is to make a balance between these two power centers. And how do we do that? And obviously, that is a challenge that we have to embark on in future. The second important factor is the Bay of Bengal. Now, that's where the interest lies. I mean, whether we like it or not, the BRI is going to be there, the Indo-Pacific is going to be there. Now, when it is the Indo-Pacific, what happens is again, we cautiously look at that. Indo-Pacific is not going to go away. So in the Pacific, the India has its strategic orientation towards the Indo-Pacific, India's national interest, and we have absolutely respect for that, as well as the US has its interest, Beijing has its interest, so do we have our interest. But on the other hand, BRI is essential for us because the very simple reason is economy has to thrive. On the other hand, we have Myanmar, which hypothetically speaking, the China-Myanmar economic corridor will be a future reality. That comes with a package called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in which Japan and Australia are partner, as well as the ASEAN is a partner. And perhaps this is where the geoeconomic plays in, and with the potential to overshadow the geostrategic realities sometimes that dominates the geostrategic principles that we get to hear within the discourse of the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision, whichever way we coin it. So therefore, again, the challenge remains which forces wants to brand how this Indo-Pacific strategy for the purpose of defense or perhaps purpose of foreign policy. Now that's where the countries like in South Asia must come together and think about rules-based and perhaps the common welfare-based approach for the Indo-Pacific, rather than thinking too much outward and too much into the defense orientation. Perhaps that should be the new normal for us to think about. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about Quad sometimes, as Professor Kangas or myself have been following that for a long time, whether it will be a maritime cooperation, whether we will be in the defense cooperation or something like that. But the main principle that we have to agree on what we want to do about it. So rather than going for too much of geostrategic verbatim, and this is where the role of the state comes in, that how we want to set up the principle, or what would be the cutoff line for that, is perhaps somewhere we should have a meaningful dialogue and discussion to come up with a particular charter. This is what we want to do. I mean, Foreign Secretary Blinken, Foreign Secretary Jahangirnagar had a fantastic meeting, but perhaps translating those into an action is perhaps something that has to come up with a tangible action. And this is where probably the challenge lies. And this is where the harmonization has to come. Now, connectivity is another issue. I mean, the next level of pandemics is not going to wait for us. And the disaster is not going to wait for us. I mean, Bangladesh Coast Guard cooperates with the Indian Coast Guards. But on the other hand, if I take after the maritime delimitation with India and Myanmar, the greater Coast Guard cooperation or the water cooperation is still missing. I mean, it is not only about the piracy or the maritime strategic cooperation, but also there is an issue like pollution. What about the plastic pollution? What about the dead zones? What about the livelihoods cooperation? And I think we already have two important institutions set up in the region, BIMSTEC and SARC. Whether we like it or not, whether the elephants in the room are a problem, but at the end of the day, can we really set up ad hoc principles? Today we are talking about BBIN, tomorrow we are talking about BCIM, day after tomorrow we will come up with new initiatives. But at the end of the day, I mean, Afghanistan is not going to go away, neither Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or nor Myanmar. So that's the reality. And with accepting the reality, rather than reinventing the wheel, and I believe we have to think about reforming the institutions. And if we think about reforming the institutions, there's no point in wasting time and resources, rather thinking about the political decisions to reform the institutions and move ahead. Artificial intelligence, and one of the colleagues was talking about artificial intelligence. If you go to Africa, I mean, unfortunately, South Asia is the least integrated region, integrated in terms of connectivity, in terms of economy, in terms of trade. I mean, look at this ASEAN. I mean, before we go to European and all this greater economic cooperation, I mean, ASEAN has 25%, almost 25% of economic intra-regional cooperation, and South Asia presents the least. At least pandemic is a new normal that tells you that, I mean, the vaccine tells you that nobody is going to wait for it. I mean, this is where at least the pandemic gives you one example that you should cooperate rather than waiting for each other. I mean, whether the Chinese will send us, the English will send us, or the Brussels will send us, that's too far away. I mean, South Asia Indians have one of the finest doctors in the world. The Chinese have the finest raw materials. And obviously, this is where the barter comes in. And I think we should go back to that principle of cooperation. That's exactly what pandemic and artificial intelligence comes in. Go back to the African example. Infrastructure is
Professor
built by
Khan,
Chinese.
Professor Khan, can you please sum
I
up?
will do it in 2 minutes, sir. Within 2 minutes, it will be over. So, and I think this is where the very important genesis comes in. The Americans are going to be there with the software and technologies, and hardware will always be coming from the Chinese. Now, that's where the whole market economy is going to rule in future. And that tells you that with those infrastructure, South Asia can make the most benefit out of it from these two great powers. Extremism definitely is going to be, but this is not one country specific, one religion specific phenomenon. This is the same problem for the Northern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. If you take the Auckland case or the Oslo case or the American case, I mean, you're seeing the different prisms are coming back. So therefore, again, the collaboration, the Western countries or the Eastern countries, whether the South Asians or the East Asians, or perhaps even if you take the North Americans or the Europeans, will have to come together to find the common agenda of eliminating both extremism. And extremism is creating protectionism. Don't forget that part of that. And protectionism is not going to be a political agenda. It's going to affect your trade and investment in next 10 to 15 years of time. The biggest problem will be the manpower export. We have a lot of people in the eastern side of the world, western side of the world. They will be affected. Migrants will be affected. And that is also will have implication on Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indian economy at some point of time. So we have to be more careful before using these terms of extremism and radicalism. And that certainly should not be specific to any particular religion, perhaps. Therefore, I'll conclude by saying the next pandemic, next disaster, and perhaps next economic shocks will require common agenda. And the sooner, the better we come together and start discussing it, not only in the defense universities, but also in different platforms with an open mind and open understanding of the issues that we have discussed today here. And look at the Malaysian case for an example. And the recent pandemic has shaken the very system of the political stability. And the norms are coming back, the rules-based issues are coming back. And with that, I would humbly request all the researchers to look forward that what are the implications of the new normals. And even if you look at the online, hate speech is coming back. There is very difficult to make a distinction between hate speech and political speech, political violence and the religious violence, and religious violence and the political and social violences. So therefore, it is a very technical issue which has not only the political implication, but also has legal implication. So we have to look into the legal side of the whole issue. So new normal has legal implications for that. Even if you take the security, digital security, the privacy security, whistleblower security. So that will have implication on the social life and political life as well. So political stability is also is an issue that will have implication for the defense stability too. So therefore, I think we have plenty of things to think about, not only the great power game, but also our bilateral, trilateral, multilateral relationship in South Asia, which has trade, which has strategy, as well as armed forces dimensions. With that, thank you very much for your patience here.